The room was already tense, heavy with the weight of history and the sharp smell of paper and ink. The walls, lined with shelves of precedent and power, seemed to press in closer as the exchange began. Richard Posner, the formidable judge whose words had cut down countless arguments, leaned forward with the precision of a scalpel. His eyes narrowed, his voice dipped low, and then he delivered the strike. "Do you even have the credentials to be here?" The words landed like a gavel, louder than any sound in the chamber. It was more than a question. It was an insult dressed in judicial authority, a dismissal wrapped in a smirk. Gasps echoed faintly across the courtroom benches, a ripple of disbelief spreading from one face to another. Some tilted their heads in shock. Others lowered their eyes, unsure of how to process the blow. Jasmine Crockett did not immediately respond. She sat still, her hands resting on the table, her breathing steady. Yet the silence that followed was not emptiness, it was alive, pulsing with tension. All eyes shifted toward her. In that moment, she was not just an attorney. She was the embodiment of every underestimated voice, every outsider who had been told they did not belong. The pause stretched long enough to feel eternal. Was she rattled? Would she stammer, shrink, or retreat beneath the shadow of Posner's towering reputation? That was the unspoken question burning through the room. Posner's gaze did not waver. He was the seasoned giant, a man whose authority often cowed even the most confident advocates. To challenge him was to risk ridicule, to risk being reduced to nothing more than a footnote in his courtroom. And yet, something subtle began to shift. A quiet resolve flickered in Crockett's expression, barely perceptible but undeniable to anyone watching closely.
She did not lean back.
She did not flinch. Instead, the corners of her mouth tightened and her eyes sharpened with the kind of fire that only comes from years of being underestimated. The air itself seemed to wait. The question hung heavy, a weapon suspended in midair. And then, just as the silence was about to break under its own weight, Crockett drew a breath. What happened next would ignite a courtroom showdown no one expected. To understand the weight of Posner's words, one must first understand the man who spoke them. Richard Posner was no ordinary judge. For decades, his sharp intellect and unflinching analysis had made him a colossus of the legal world. His opinions were studied in law schools, his critiques dissected in journals, his reputation feared by attorneys who dared to step foot in his courtroom. He was the kind of figure who could reduce a seasoned lawyer to silence with nothing more than a raised eyebrow or a barbed question. Against him, even the confident trembled, and seated across from him was Jasmine Crockett, young by judicial standards, dismissed by many as untested, and constantly having to prove her worth. She carried not the pedigree of the elite, but the lived reality of struggle. For every diploma there had been a closed door. For every small victory there had been voices whispering she was unprepared, undeserving, misplaced in rooms designed for others. To some she was still the outsider, a woman of color, a disruptor, someone who didn't fit the mold of what power looked like. That is why his question stung more than the words themselves. It echoed centuries of gatekeeping, of voices told they did not belong, and in that echo lay the stakes of this confrontation. Crockett was not merely answering for herself, but for countless others who had faced the same scrutiny. The courtroom was no longer just a chamber of law. It had become a stage on which two visions of justice collided. On one side stood Posner, the embodiment of establishment strength wielding skepticism like a sword. On the other sat Crockett, the rising figure whose every move was measured against impossible standards, her very presence daring to challenge the notion of who gets to speak with authority in America. But this clash was more than credentials. It was about proving who truly understood justice. Would it be the giant who had spent a lifetime interpreting the law from the highest perch, or the fighter who had lived its consequences in the trenches? The audience could feel it. Some leaned forward, eager to witness the inevitable dismantling of the newcomer. Others, quieter but resolute, held on to hope that she might stand tall, that she might refuse to yield. The tension was not abstract, it was deeply personal. Because Crockett's answer, whatever it would be, had the power to either reinforce the barriers that had silenced so many before her, or to shatter them. This was not a polite exchange of legal theory. This was a test of belonging, of legitimacy, of identity itself, and the stakes were far higher than anyone in the gallery first realized. If Crockett faltered, the skeptics would claim vindication. If she rose, the impact would reverberate far beyond the walls of that courtroom. As the silence after Posner's question stretched into eternity, the room itself seemed to hold its breath. Because what was about to unfold was no longer just about one woman defending her place at a table. It was about who would define the very meaning of justice in a nation still divided between those who guard the gates and those who demand to walk through them. And in that electric pause, one truth became undeniable. The next words would not only decide the fate of the moment, they would decide the legacy of the clash itself. Richard Posner was not just a judge, he was a force of nature in American law. His mind worked like a machine sharpened to a razor's edge, slicing through arguments with surgical precision. For decades, attorneys who entered his courtroom carried the quiet dread of being unmasked, of having every weakness in their reasoning dragged into the light. He had built a reputation not merely as a legal thinker, but as a dismantler of illusions. To stand before him was to face the possibility of intellectual dismemberment. His wit was legendary. Colleagues often recalled how Posner could turn a complex legal puzzle into a cutting one-liner that left an entire room nodding in awe or wincing in humiliation. He had the gift of making clarity look effortless, the curse of exposing how muddled everyone else seemed in comparison. For law students, he was a model of intellectual courage. For practicing attorneys, he was the storm they hoped to avoid. Posner thrived on this aura. He relished the power of language, wielding words as both shield and sword. Where others sought consensus, he pursued confrontation. Where others layered diplomacy, he stripped matters bare. To him, truth emerged not from politeness but from precision, not from deference but from debate. And that conviction made him formidable. But woven into this brilliance was a shadow, a flaw as old as hubris itself. Posner often measured people not only by their arguments, but by whether he believed they belonged in the arena at all. He respected strength, intelligence, pedigree. He dismissed those he deemed lesser. This habit, sharpened over years of authority, often led him to underestimate. And underestimation, though subtle, can be fatal in a battle of wits. To understand Posner's stature, one must see how he towered above his peers. His judicial writings filled shelves. His influence stretched into economics, policy, even philosophy. He was not merely a judge, but an architect of thought, reshaping debates far beyond his courtroom. He stood as a guardian of rigor, the gatekeeper of credibility. Few dared to challenge him, fewer still succeeded, and those who did rarely walked away unscathed. This reputation had its rewards. He was celebrated as fearless, admired as unflinching, hailed as one of the most prolific judges in American history. But there was another side whispered in quieter corners. Younger attorneys, particularly those without elite credentials, told stories of how Posner's dismissive tone cut deeper than his logic. They spoke of the chill that ran through a courtroom when he turned his questions not toward the law but toward the worthiness of the advocate, standing before him. And it was in this pattern, this reflex to measure dignity by credentials, that the seeds of downfall were sown. Posner was not malicious. He was confident, too confident, so certain of his intellectual fortress that he sometimes forgot. Brilliance without humility can become blindness. For years, this flaw went unchecked because few dared to exploit it. Who would challenge the master of dismantling arguments at their very foundation? Who would willingly step into the fire? To most, survival meant deference. But to Jasmine Crockett, silence was never survival. She had not climbed her way through struggle and sacrifice merely to nod politely when her very presence was questioned. The collision between these two figures was inevitable. On one side, a giant of law, sharpened by decades of dominance. On the other, a rising force steeled by a lifetime of being underestimated. The courtroom was merely the battlefield on which their stories would finally meet. And yet what made this moment so dangerous for Posner was not Crockett's argument alone. It was his own blind spot. The same instinct that had made him fearless also left him exposed. He had dismissed her as unworthy before she had spoken a single word. He had already decided she did not belong, and in that presumption, he had handed her the very weapon she needed to turn the clash against him. The brilliance that made him respected, the sharpness that made him feared, the authority that made him untouchable, all of it stood poised to collapse under the weight of his own arrogance. And as he leaned forward, eyes narrowing, voice dripping with disdain, Few in the room could imagine that this moment so familiar, so routine for the man who had silenced so many before, would soon become the turning point of his legacy. Yet the very qualities that made him feared would soon leave him speechless. Before Jasmine Crockett ever stood in the shadow of Richard Posner's towering skepticism, she had already walked through shadows far darker. Her story was not the tale of a privileged climb, cushioned by connections and credentials. It was a story of grit, of doors slammed in her face, of being told over and over again that she wasn't supposed to make it. And yet each obstacle became the very steel that forged her resolve. She was no stranger to bias. From the earliest days of her career, she encountered the quiet doubts, the raised eyebrows, the subtle question marks attached to her presence in rooms dominated by the familiar faces of privilege. At job interviews, she was asked questions that seemed less about her knowledge and more about her identity. In law school corridors, she heard whispers. Was she really cut out for this? Did she belong? What many didn't see was the weight she carried just to reach those corridors. Financial hurdles pressed against her at every turn. While others breezed through courses supported by generational wealth or networks of influence, Jasmine juggled part-time jobs, late-night study sessions, and the constant calculation of whether she could afford another semester. Every textbook was an investment, every tuition payment a battle. She knew the stakes. Failure was not just personal, it was generational. Yet she endured, not with the arrogance of entitlement, but with the persistence of someone who understood that her journey was not just her own. Every hour spent studying after exhaustion, every extra shift taken to keep afloat, every time she swallowed pride and endured condescension, these were not acts of survival alone. They were acts of defiance, proof that the barriers built to keep her out would not hold forever. Her motivation was never vanity. She was not chasing law for prestige or for the title that could be etched onto a nameplate. For Jasmine Crockett, the law was service. It was protection. It was a weapon against injustice in communities like the one that raised her, communities that too often had been ignored, overlooked, or actively silenced. She carried the weight of their stories into every classroom, every courtroom, every conversation where justice was at stake. And it was that weight that gave her power. While Posner wielded authority from a pedestal of elitism, Crockett drew strength from empathy. She had seen what injustice looked like not in theory, but in practice. Families broken by unfair rulings, workers silenced by corporations with endless resources, neighbors living in fear because their voices went unheard. The law for her was not an abstract puzzle to be solved. It was a lifeline. Her humility was not weakness, it was the foundation of her resilience. She didn't walk into courtrooms expecting deference. She walked in ready to fight for it. Every victory she earned was carved from resistance. Every respect she gained pulled from the jaws of skepticism. Unlike those who inherited opportunity, Crockett created it brick by brick with a determination that could not be bought or bestowed. And that contrast to Richard Posner could not have been more striking. Where he carried the sheen of establishment prestige, she carried the scars of survival. Where he commanded with arrogance, she led with empathy. He was the product of a system that elevated brilliance but often ignored humanity. She was the product of a struggle that demanded brilliance in order to preserve humanity. This duality is what made her story magnetic. Audiences who learned of her journey didn't see just another lawyer. They saw themselves. They saw their own struggles reflected in hers, their own doubts echoed in her battles, their own hopes embodied in her persistence. Crockett was not simply a figure in law. She was a symbol of what it meant to rise despite the odds, to answer the unspoken question of worthiness with undeniable action, and the victories she amassed were not small. Each courtroom battle became a chapter in her testament to resilience. She faced seasoned opponents with far more resources, far more connections, far more acceptance in the system. But time and again she refused to bend. When she won, it was not merely a legal victory, it was proof. Proof that the outsider could stand against the establishment. Proof that credentials could not overshadow competence. Proof that dignity could triumph over dismissal. Still, the skepticism never disappeared. Figures like Posner, pillars of the establishment, continued to measure her not by what she had achieved, but by whether they believed she should have been allowed to achieve it at all. That sting never fully faded, but it sharpened her. Every doubt became fuel. Every dismissal became determination. Every barrier became another reason to keep climbing. And now in this courtroom all of it converged. The struggles of her past, the scars of bias, the weight of financial battles, the victories earned in spite of it all. They gathered behind her like an invisible army. Across from her sat the embodiment of everything that had sought to keep her in place, everything that had questioned her right to stand tall. This was not just another exchange of words. It was the culmination of a lifetime of defiance against doubt, of resilience against rejection. The moment Posner questioned her credentials, he unknowingly summoned every trial she had already endured, and every triumph that had carried her to this exact point. And it was in this courtroom that all those battles would converge into a single moment. The silence after Posner's question lingered like smoke in the air, curling into every corner of the courtroom. But silence alone was not enough for Richard Posner. He leaned back, adjusted his glasses, and pressed on. His voice, cool and deliberate, carried the weight of both intellect and disdain. If you claim to stand in this arena, then tell me, what exactly sets you apart? What foundation do you claim, when so many here possess credentials that dwarf yours? It was not merely an inquiry. It was a performance staged for the gallery, meant to underscore the gap between him and the woman sitting across the table. His tone dripped with the certainty that the question itself was unanswerable, that her silence would soon betray her. Crockett did not flinch. She sat upright, her hands steady, her eyes locked on him. Each word he spoke was like a hammer striking the same point: credentials, foundation, pedigree. The repetition was intentional, designed to wear her down, to remind her and everyone listening that she was, in his mind, an intruder in his kingdom. The audience could feel the tension rise. Whispers darted from one row to another. Some leaned forward, eager to see her falter. Others bit their lips, willing her silently to hold firm. It was a spectacle, a test not of law but of will, a duel in which perception mattered as much as truth. Law is not about appearances, Posner continued, his voice sharp enough to cut. It is about rigor, history, mastery, and mastery cannot be improvised. So I ask again, what credentials do you bring that justify your seat at this table? The words were cold, calculated, and cruel. They were not just aimed at Crockett. They were aimed at every person who had ever clawed their way into spaces where they were told they did not belong. Posner was not simply questioning her resume. He was questioning her right to exist in this arena at all. Still, Crockett remained motionless. Her calmness was striking. To some, it might have seemed like hesitation. To others, it looked like composure forged in fire. She had faced bias before. She had faced poverty before. She had faced doubt before. What was one more voice, even if that voice belonged to a giant? The silence grew heavier, almost unbearable. The air felt thick, as though the very oxygen in the room was waiting to see whether she would rise or crumble. Every second of her pause turned the tension tighter, like a string pulled to its breaking point. And yet behind that stillness something was building. Crockett's eyes did not dart nervously. They focused, narrowing with intensity like an archer drawing her bow. She was not lost. She was preparing. Posner, mistaking her pause for weakness, pressed even harder. Your presence here is tolerated, not earned. Surely you recognize that. Surely you must understand that in a room of such stature, your voice carries little weight. Would you not agree? It was the kind of rhetorical blow meant to end a debate. The strike delivered with such confidence that the opponent collapses before even attempting to respond. The room seemed to tilt in his favor. The murmurs grew louder. The question hung in the air like a guillotine. And then something changed. Crockett's lips parted slightly, her breath measured, her face calm but resolute. She did not rush. She did not stumble. She let the silence serve her. Let it gather every ounce of attention in the room until the only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. When she finally spoke, her words carried a weight that silence alone could never hold. They were not defensive. They were not timid. They were precise, deliberate, chosen with the same care one takes in selecting a key to fit a lock. And in that instant, the energy in the courtroom shifted. Then, with one carefully chosen phrase, she shifted the entire room's energy. For a moment, Jasmine Crockett let the silence hold. The courtroom had been dragged into Posner's rhythm, pulled into his cadence of challenge and dismissal. But now the tempo was hers. When she finally spoke, it wasn't with volume or fury. It was with clarity. The kind of clarity that forces everyone to lean in rather than recoil. You ask about my credentials, she began, her voice steady, her tone measured. But in this courtroom, credentials are not just diplomas on a wall or names in a directory. They are the lives you've changed, the battles you've fought, the victories you've earned when everyone said you couldn't. The words hung there, cutting through the arrogance that had filled the chamber. The gallery shifted, restless with anticipation. Crockett was not playing defense, she was redefining the terms of the contest. She continued, each sentence sharper than the last. You want to know what makes me worthy of this seat? Let me remind you. There was a pause, long enough for Posner to raise an eyebrow, long enough for every spectator to wonder if she truly had the arsenal to back her claim. And then she struck. In State v. Morales, when a young man with no resources was wrongfully accused and left without hope, I took his case. The prosecution had the weight of the state behind them. I had little more than determination, but I uncovered the evidence they overlooked, exposed the holes in their story, and proved his innocence. That man walked free not because of credentials but because justice demanded it. The gallery rustled, murmurs rising like wind through leaves. Faces turned, glances exchanged. They remembered the case. It had been covered in the local press, a story of David toppling Goliath. And here was the lawyer who had made it happen. Crockett didn't stop. Her voice grew stronger, her words deliberate. In the case of Reed v. Horizon Corp., I stood against one of the most powerful employers in the state. They thought they could bury a worker's claims of discrimination under mountains of paperwork and intimidation. They thought resources could drown out truth, but they underestimated what persistence can uncover. We won. That victory wasn't just a paycheck, it was dignity restored, a message that power does not equal impunity. Gasps slipped through the crowd, louder this time. A few heads nodded in approval. One man in the gallery even whispered, audible enough for the row behind him to hear, "She's the one who took them down." Posner shifted in his seat. His expression was still guarded, still composed, but something subtle had changed. The certainty in his eyes flickered, replaced by calculation. He had expected a stammer, not a storm. And when the city tried to silence activists in Bailey versus City of Dallas, Crockett pressed on. I stood beside those voices. They said the protests were disorderly. They said the community should sit down and stay quiet. But I argued, successfully, that free speech is not disorderly when it demands justice. Those voices still ring in the streets today because the court ruled in their favor, and I was there to make sure they were heard. The room erupted, not in applause, for this was still a courtroom, but in energy. Murmurs grew louder, spreading in ripples across the benches. A woman in the back covered her mouth with her hand as if trying to stifle a cheer. Another whispered, "That was her? I remember that case." Each case was more than a legal citation. It was a piece of living history. Crockett was weaving her victories into a narrative not of ego but of service. She wasn't boasting. She was testifying to a record that credentials alone could never capture. Her voice slowed, deliberate now, as though she wanted each word to land like a hammer striking a nail. My credentials are written not in titles but in outcomes. They are written in freedom restored, rights defended, voices protected. They are written in the victories that say no one is too small to matter, and no system is too big to escape accountability. By now, the gallery was no longer just an audience. It was a chorus of reaction. Whispers swirled. A collective breath seemed to hang on every sentence. For the first time in the exchange, Posner was not the center of gravity. Crockett was, and then she landed the blow that no one could ignore. You want to measure me by paper, by prestige? Fine. But the people I've defended don't ask where I studied. They ask whether I will fight for them. And I have, over and over again. That is my foundation. That is my mastery. That is why I am here. The words detonated in the room. There was no need for raised voices, no need for theatrics. The simplicity was its own thunder. Posner's lips pressed tightly together. For a man known for quick retorts, sharp interruptions, devastating rebuttals, his silence was deafening. The gallery noticed. Whispers gave way to wide eyes. For once, the feared giant had nothing to say. Crockett did not gloat. She did not smirk. She simply let the silence linger. A silence now weighted in her favor. She had answered his question not with defensiveness but with undeniable truth. And in that silence, something shifted permanently. The courtroom no longer belonged to Posner's authority. It belonged to Crockett's dignity. The whispers became quiet admiration. Even the clerk at the side of the room seemed to sit a little straighter, as if sensing that history had tilted. It was the mic drop moment. the instant when the underdog not only held her ground but seized the stage. And as Posner sat there, lips sealed, eyes clouded with the realization that his tactic had failed, the moral of the clash became clear. Results speak louder than credentials. Her voice, calm but unyielding, carried one final line that echoed like a verdict. So, Judge Posner, if you're asking what makes me worthy, the answer is simple: justice itself. The gallery erupted, not in cheers, for the courtroom demanded restraint, but in energy that could not be contained. Heads turned, jaws dropped, and eyes widened in disbelief. Some leaned back in their seats, whispering, "She silenced him." Others shook their heads in amazement, as though they had just witnessed something they would retell for years. And there it was. Richard Posner, the man whose sharp tongue had shredded countless opponents, left staring in silence at the woman he had tried to belittle. His greatest weapon, his voice, suddenly felt heavy, unusable. But the shockwaves wouldn't stop in that courtroom. The moment the gavel struck and the session adjourned, the courtroom seemed to release its breath. But outside those heavy oak doors, the real storm had only just begun. Within minutes, the exchange had leapt from whispers in the gallery to the glowing screens of millions. A clip, less than a minute long, spread like wildfire across social media. The caption was simple, sharp, and impossible to ignore. Crockett silences Posner. Hashtags surged into trending territory before the hour was up. Her credentials vs. justice. Crockett vs. Posner. Underdog wins. Twitter threads dissected her every word. TikToks replayed her mic drop line on loop, and Instagram reels set it to triumphant music. What had begun as a courtroom clash became a cultural flashpoint. Journalists scrambled to keep up with the velocity of the narrative. Major outlets ran headlines that read like declarations. Judge Posner meets his match. Jasmine Crockett redefines credentials. Pundits who once doubted her composure now marveled at the precision of her counterattack. On cable news panels, anchors leaned forward in excitement, their voices pitched higher than usual as they replayed the moment Posner fell silent. "Credentials?" one commentator remarked. She didn't just answer the question, she reframed the entire debate. This wasn't about where she studied or who endorsed her. This was about who actually delivers justice. By evening, the ripple effects had leapt beyond the legal world. Celebrities weighed in, actors, musicians, and authors who had long championed stories of outsiders rising against the odds. One well-known filmmaker tweeted, "I've seen courtroom dramas on screen, but this was real." Crockett just gave a masterclass in dignity and power. Politicians followed. Progressive leaders hailed her as a model of grit and authenticity. A senator posted, "This is what leadership looks like: calm, courageous, rooted in service." Even those outside her political camp admitted, sometimes grudgingly, that her performance had been remarkable. But perhaps most powerful were the grassroots voices. Activists from immigrant communities, young law students, single parents working 2 jobs while studying at night, they saw themselves in her. A viral Facebook post from a community organizer captured the sentiment. When she stood there, facing down the establishment, she carried all of us with her. Every time someone told us we weren't good enough, she answered for us. Clips of her earlier victories resurfaced, stitched into montages that celebrated not only the courtroom moment, but the journey behind it. Commentators described her as a symbol of resilience, a living rebuke to the gatekeepers who insisted only certain pedigrees deserved respect. Crockett wasn't just a lawyer anymore, she was becoming an emblem, a story people told their children about persistence, courage, and the audacity to belong where others said you couldn't. Posner's silence became its own meme. Screenshots of his tightened lips and furrowed brow spread across timelines with captions like, "When the receipts are too strong to argue." For a man whose authority was built on words, his wordlessness was the sharpest defeat of all. And yet even amid the applause and the trending hashtags, a deeper chord had been struck. This wasn't just spectacle, it was validation. For every immigrant who had been asked, "Do you even belong here?" For every first-generation student told their degree wasn't enough. For every underdog forced to prove twice over what others were given at birth, Jasmine Crockett had stood as their proxy, their defender, their mirror. The noise swelled, the praise poured in, the headlines multiplied. But beneath it all was the sense that something larger was unfolding. This wasn't simply a viral moment, it was the spark of a story whose reach could not yet be measured. And yet the true legacy of this clash wasn't in the headlines. As the initial shockwaves of the courtroom moment rippled outward, Jasmine Crockett took a step back. Not physically, but in the sense of perspective. She allowed the moment to settle, to breathe, and then she reframed it. What had been framed as a challenge to her credentials became, in her hands, a lesson far larger than any individual clash. She reminded everyone that credentials, titles, and pedigrees were not the ultimate measure of justice. Actions, results, and integrity carried far more weight. It is not the letters after a name, she said, nor the prestige of institutions that define our ability to seek justice. It is what we do with our knowledge, how we serve, and how we stand for those whose voices might otherwise be silenced. Her words reverberated like a bell across a nation hungry for stories of dignity and triumph. The message was simple yet profound. Resilience and moral courage outweigh arrogance and inherited authority. Her victory became a symbol not of defiance alone, but of affirmation. For every person who had been dismissed, underestimated, or told they didn't belong, Crockett's presence and composure served as proof that persistence and purpose could break barriers. She demonstrated that standing firm in the truth and letting results speak for themselves was not just effective. It was transformative. The broader resonance was unmistakable. This wasn't merely a personal win. It was a lesson for the nation. Crockett's response reminded America of the values it aspired to uphold: fairness over favoritism, opportunity over gatekeeping, democracy over elitism. It was a call to believe that the legal system and society at large could be inclusive, that merit could coexist with compassion, and that even those who start at a disadvantage can rise to redefine what justice looks like. The emotional crescendo built naturally. Social media, commentary, and public reflection coalesced into a shared sense of hope. People from all walks of life felt seen, inspired, and validated. Her victory was no longer only about one courtroom battle. It was about every battle waged by the underdog in everyday life. Parents whispered it to their children, students carried it in their notebooks, and activists echoed it in community halls. Every triumph she articulated became a seed of empowerment planted in the minds and hearts of those watching. And yet, she did not stop with applause or recognition. She reminded the audience that dignity was not a momentary gift, it was a practice. That resilience was not just surviving, but thriving in the face of doubt. That justice was not a privilege reserved for the entitled, but a promise owed to all. Her words stitched together the moral fabric of the moment. The fight for recognition, fairness, and opportunity was ongoing, and each act of courage contributed to a legacy far greater than any one victory. By the time her statement concluded, the courtroom, the nation, and the digital world had absorbed a truth both timeless and urgently needed. Her presence, her achievements, and her unwavering composure became a living manifesto. The measure of a person's worth is found in their actions, not the assumptions of those who would diminish them. Arrogance might dominate temporarily, but it cannot withstand the quiet power of consistent, principled action. And as the applause, the whispers, and the awe faded into reflection, the lesson settled deeply into every consciousness it touched. Courage, service, and integrity redefine what it means to belong. Achievements rooted in purpose will outshine doubt, and voices grounded in truth will always carry farther than any challenge meant to silence them. And as long as voices like hers rise, no doubt will ever silence justice. Richard Posner, the man whose reputation could silence seasoned lawyers, had questioned her credentials. Yet in that very courtroom, his words meant to diminish were met with calm, unwavering truth. Jasmine Crockett did not just answer the challenge. She transformed it into a demonstration of what real strength looks like. She proved that victories, earned through courage, persistence, and integrity, speak louder than doubt. This wasn't merely a personal triumph. It was a statement to every person who has ever been underestimated, overlooked, or told they don't belong. Crockett's story reminds us that the measure of a person cannot be found in titles or endorsements. It is found in action, in service, and in the courage to stand firm even when the odds are stacked against you. If you felt inspired by this moment, take it further. Subscribe to join a community that celebrates courage over arrogance, resilience over dismissal, and truth over pretension. Share this story to amplify the voices of those who challenge the system and redefine what it means to belong. Let this be more than a video. Let it be a movement, a reminder that dignity and integrity can, and will, change the world. Because in the end, the measure of greatness isn't in credentials, it's in courage. Every choice to stand, every fight for justice, every moment of unwavering resolve matters. And in witnessing Jasmine Crockett's triumph, we are reminded that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they refuse to be silenced.